Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kwong, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is Sol Smith, a writer, professor, life coach, and neurodivergent consultant specializing in mindset, happiness, and self-liberation courses. In sharing his journey with dyslexia, ADHD, and autism, Sol highlights the challenges and gifts of being neurodivergent inside a neurotypical society. In this conversation, we reflect on Sol's journey being diagnosed in adulthood, finding neuro-affirming support, and different ways neurodivergent people can play to our strengths and interests. Yeah, well, actually, first, I realized I haven't heard you say your name out loud. Is it Sol?
Oh, yes, it's Sol, yeah.
Okay.
Like S-O-U. I'm named after the Roman sun god, so that's...
I was like, that's an awesome name, Sol Smith. It really rolls off the tongue, but I kept wanting to say Saul, like Better Call Saul.
A lot of people, because of that show, really, I swear. A lot of people figure, but God, that's a good show, so I can't complain.
That is a very good show, so there is that.
Yeah.
But, I reached out to you because, truthfully, I think just because of my own interests about wellness and neurodivergence, your content started showing up on my feed, and I followed you. And I may not have been there at the very beginning of your journey when you began sharing your experience with ADHD and neurodivergence, but something about it that when you share like your internal world and your internal processes, something about it just really resonated with me. So thank you for saying yes and for being willing to speak with a stranger over the internet, as I like to say.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that the whole reason why I'm any good at describing my internal processes is because I went so long having no idea that what we were looking at was autism. But I was always really fascinated with how I think. Like I just, since I was a kid, I could tell it was a little different, and I would try to sort of explain it. And I really dove into it once I was a professor, and I was working on a class about metacognition and education. And I just really dove into how I think to try and show some ways to differently process the school experience. And I wrote a whole book about how I think. And that was about 3 years before I realized I was autistic. And so anyway, my point is that I think that it would have been different had I had all of the language of autism and research. It would sound a lot like how everybody else describes it. But instead, I kind of had to reinvent the wheel from a very perceptive point of view. So an autistic point of view, really just the ground up. Anyway, that's my theory as to why people hear what I say and say, oh my gosh, this really describes it. I haven't heard it described that way. Is I really had to reinvent the wheel because I just never considered autism, until I dove into the subject.
Mm-hmm. That was something that occurred with me as well. I didn't really think about it as a subject matter that much, even though I have always talked about mental health and wellness. And then it was a book that just caught my eye. For some reason, it's called Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. And I just started...
Oh, yeah. That's a great book.
Yeah. And something about it seemed approachable. And I was just curious about the subject overall, I thought at the time. But as I got deeper into it, I was like, wow, these are such profoundly, I thought, specific experiences that I didn't realize was part of a greater kind of a collective, so to speak. What's been your experience sharing it publicly on a platform? Like, what's that been for you?
It's been really affirming. When I started describing some of it really kind of more research based. I was working on a master's in psychology and really got into it. The book that turned me on was called Neurotribes, and that was a few years ago. And I started seeing myself in that. And then I kind of read every autism book out there. And I think I got Unmasking Autism about a week after it was published and felt really seen by it. But so I was sharing a lot of stuff sort of more research-based. And then, embarrassingly enough, one day I had a meltdown and while I was having the meltdown, I was cognizant of the fact that this is the first time I've had a meltdown while knowing this is autism.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to watch this and see what's going on. And so I kind of watched as it was happening. And the next day, in order to sort of process it, I made a video about it. And I just kind of thought, this is kind of embarrassing, but I only have like 180 followers or whatever. This will be fine. And it just blew up. People were like saying, oh my gosh, this is what it's like. And I just had no idea that people would have that similar of an experience. And so all of a sudden I started gaining some traction online, and I made another video about communication problem, about when you're in conflict with somebody and you're using autistic ground up reasoning to try and solve the conflict, while the other person is processing it completely differently, and how hard that is, even though it seems completely illogical in the autistic mind that the other person wouldn't grasp your logic. And I made that one thinking, this is I think I even said in the video, I know this is probably a really individual experience and I don't think anybody's going to relate. And instead, everybody related. And I was blown away because I had never, in all of my time being fascinated with myself, being fascinated with how I think and sharing it with people, I never ran into somebody who had those same experiences. And it was really interesting to find that the world is peppered with people who've had these same experiences and frustrations, and either have or haven't articulated it as such, but were able to join my conversation so fluently. So it's been really affirming, and it's also been I guess a little bit bittersweet because I am just slightly less unique than I thought I was. If that makes any sense. It's much better to have the community than not.
Sure.
But whereas I just considered myself like so individual, and then I find out that there's a label for it that really sticks. It was I guess humbling is the word, but I just never considered myself to have a label, and that's probably because I've defied most of them through my life until we got to here. And of course, the label, I try to stress to people that, when you're saying you're autistic, that this is descriptive, that you are not saying something that causes a condition wherein you behave and process in certain ways, that instead you are seeing the way you behave and process and you are describing it through this word, And since it's a spectrum, of course, it can be so many things, and it's so terribly misunderstood by people. And it's anyway, yeah. So it's been both really great to get to know the community, and just a little bit humbling in that I've really learned to know myself differently, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that honesty about that. It was both great, and also there was a part of you that said, well, I can no longer contextualize my experiences the same way anymore, which is always interesting, and humbling is a good word for it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I went through the diagnosis process, and I knew where this was heading. I knew that it was going to be autism, and when it came to me and the psychiatrist said these things, I really felt a pang of grief. I really felt something hit me as that I didn't expect. That I was like, oh, and it was I had to sit with it for a while and think, is this something I'm going to tell people? Is this something I'm keeping to myself? And of course, I can't keep anything to myself, so no problem.
I wonder if that's the writer inside of you as well, to be like, well, I thought part of this was just a human condition that will remain a mystery. And then you just get a neat little word to sum it all up. That's kind of funny to me.
Right. Yeah. And what's funny is you mentioned writing, and I have read several books that I have said were written somewhat autistically, just as a colloquialism. And looking back now, I see that I really did relate to them on that level, like Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. It's encyclopedic in its sort of self-awareness. And anything by Tolstoy is such a deep dive into the thought process that I always like, I would read Tolstoy and go, it's like this guy's reading my mind. Like I had no idea people had internal worlds like mine. It was just so spot on. And of course, lots of people have read Tolstoy and thought that. So maybe it's just that he's really good at catching the internal narrative. But yeah, like it was interesting to start reframing things throughout my life and throughout my just career of reading books has made all sorts of differences in my understanding.
Well, and I also know that you went through the diagnosis process well into adulthood, so later in life. And that tends to have its own conversation about that experience versus someone who may have started tackling the subject way earlier in life. So could you care to share some of what that's like for you and how you went about it in adulthood and with your relationships?
Yeah, I think that part of my experience is pretty universal to the late diagnosed autistic of 2023, which is that I had suspicions before the pandemic hit, but the pandemic, I think, forced a lot of us to unmask, and not just autistics.
Yes.
I'm seeing a lot of late blooming, bisexuals and homosexuals coming out, like they've come to realize themselves differently. My son came out as male during the pandemic. And my theory is that after about 3 months of being with ourselves and not masking in public, many of us were forced to face ourselves in a different way.
Yes.
And, and I think for autistics, one of the things that really, really got to me was everybody saying, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get back to normal. I can't wait till we're back to normal. And I was like, I thought we all hated that. Like, you guys really liked that? You guys wanted this? No, like, we need to rebuild normal. And seeing that not everybody was having the same experience of like just anxiety and irritation in public made me realize that my suspicions of autism were probably affecting me in ways that I had not looked at yet. That there were parts of my mind that I thought everybody shared that I didn't see a difference in. And part of that was social interactions. I really figured that most people were on the same page as me as like, God, I hate meetings. God, I hate being in person. Small talk is terrible. I thought all these things were just like we were ready to shed these things. And instead it was kind of just me. Yeah. I think that coming to grips with it as an adult also makes us look at our careers differently and how many times we've struggled with coworkers and bosses and different things. And of course, I'm, nothing at all to my current situation. I work in an art college, so it's pretty copacetic as far as fitting in goes. A lot of divergent minds there, but there's lots of different touch points where I've started learning that I was askew in my relationship to people in ways that at the time I could not have known. And there's some embarrassment there. There's some real embarrassment because I thought of myself as very self-aware because of how introspective I was. But what I wasn't aware of was especially this hierarchical type of communication that goes on at work, that I would get comfortable with somebody and think, well, we're friends. You say we're like family, and then, yeah, it feels like we're family. So, here's what I want to tell you about what's going on here. And that kind of feedback was sometimes taken as, rude or brutish or just really blunt, and is the kind of thing that starts knocking your reputation off balance in little ways that are really hard to dig up from. I think that a lot of autistics, that once they realize that something is going wrong in a relationship, it's like quicksand.
Yeah.
Because every time we try to fix it, it's just more and more misunderstanding.
Yeah. I can say I relate to that so much without saying so much, but yeah, that is so accurate. That just describes so many relationship loops I've been in, and I'm just like, why does this keep happening? That's exactly what you're describing in so many ways. As a late diagnosed autistic, I'm curious if you could describe life beforehand. What would it have looked like in everyday life for Soul, and what is a masked soul, if you could describe it?
Gosh, you mean before I realized, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, you helped me find the thread. From about age 12 or 13 until age 40, I had an eating disorder, and I had no idea. I really didn't. And again, this is one of these places where I never felt like a label described something about me.
Yeah.
And I was reading a textbook that my wife was going back to college, and she was taking a health class, and it was just a very general, like, overall sort of health thing that's a general requirement, and not especially a deep dive. And I was just flipping through the textbook because I do that, and I got to this section about binge eating disorder, and it was just a paragraph, and it described me so well. It was like reading a secret that I had written down that I had been keeping from myself.
Wow.
That for 25 plus years, I had been binge eating, like, secretly by myself, and in such a way, like, it seems hard to believe, but in such a way that I very much never saw it as happening in some strange way. And I realized that at that point, that, wow, there's a name for this. That means I can probably talk to somebody about it and help unwind this knot. And so I got a therapist, and I explained this, just thinking, like, this is actually really embarrassing. Like, I didn't know this was happening. And turns out that's really common. And with therapy and working with my doctor, I tackled this eating disorder and started exercising and to ease my anxiety. And all of a sudden, it was like a couple months into this, it was like felt like I was kind of vibrating. I was like, there's something going on here. I was like, I'm anxious,
Mm-hmm.
and I have really tumultuous feelings,
Mm-hmm.
like I had never experienced before. And, like, my kids and my wife were like, hey, are you okay? And I was like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. Like, I really felt like something irrational was happening inside me. And I've, later learned that autistics often develop a chemical dependency, a gambling addiction, or an eating disorder as part of the masking process. And what I've come to realize is that I had created something that was shameful and a secret that I had to keep. And so I was able to put all of my anxiety and all of my, like, tumultuous emotions into this one place, and think that was the cause of, like, all of my problems, and that I had to keep it secret. I liken it to, like, if I was robbing banks, I'd have to keep that secret. And so all day long, I would act like a normal citizen, and I would know just cognitively, I'm doing this because I'm covering up for this. And it would make some sense to me. And that's what I was doing, was I was covering up for something. And that was helping me wear a mask that masked everything. And it occurs to me that that's probably what's going on with every autistic who's dealt with an addiction, is that it's an aspect of masking. It's an aspect of, like, outsourcing your anxiety into something, like, tangible. And, which isn't to say that I didn't have all those autistic characteristics, but I wasn't aware of how shaky I felt in interactions with people. I wasn't aware of how self-conscious I was, just all these different things. And it changed my life for the better, for sure. But all of a sudden, I had this, like, tremendous amount of emotional energy that I never had before. And after my first meltdown, I went to a therapist and said, and I explained what happened, and it was my first really unmasked, very emotional meltdown. And I explained what happened, and she says, okay, well, this happens. And I said, no, you don't understand. This was completely irrational. And she goes, yes, no, I know it was irrational. And I'm like, it made no sense to me. I do not behave this way. And she said, well, you're human. And I was like, I don't even know if I am. Like, this was so strange to me, and I had, like, which isn't to say that I hadn't had, feelings or whatever before then, but it was the first time that I had really experienced the full spectrum of feelings that I had been masking. And it was an alien experience to feel so completely unhinged, like I was not cognitively deciding to feel and act this way. And I felt like I had lost control, and that seemed psychotic to me. But turns out that's just a thing, you know, and I just had never experienced it.
Well, you speak on getting support, working with a therapist, working with other
Mm-hmm.
individuals to help support this journey of understanding. Do you have any
Mm-hmm.
recommendations or things that you recommend people think about when they're trying to find a therapist, or maybe they think they might be neurodivergent in some way, but they need to go through the process? Like, what are some things to
Mm-hmm.
consider when trying to work with someone like that?
I think that you have to really, the first thing is, I really want to validate self-diagnosis, and really point to that as a really important part of the process. If you are um, in a mental state where you can do a lot of studying about autism, I think that's a really, really important step, because a lot of medical professionals and a lot of therapists do not understand it. It's just, frankly, there's so much for them to understand in their fields. And you have like 2.7% of the population is autistic. So that may not be the first thing that crosses their, continuing education radar. So a lot of them have a more antiquated view of autism, or a very academic view. And the first couple therapists I worked with, like one was great with the eating disorder, but she did not understand the other stuff going on with me. And she would float different ideas all the time, saying something like, gosh, maybe is there narcissism in your family? And I was like, Jesus, do you think this is narcissism? And it was interesting. And I read like several books on narcissism, and I was like, no, that, like, I see some traits, but that's not happening here, I don't think. And she was like, God, you have trauma, abandonment issues? And I'd be like, I had a great childhood. I'd go back in a second. I don't know.
Mm.
Like, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like, it was like we knew there was something off, and she couldn't figure it out. And so I started finding another therapist, and my second therapist was much better with me, though it was probably 2 months into our relationship when I had been reading a lot of books about autism, and decided I would just float this idea to her. And I floated it, and she goes, yeah, I've been suspecting that for a while. I just didn't feel like it was my place to bring it up. And I was like, what? You didn't feel
Interesting.
like... Yeah. I was like, wow, okay. But so there are just, and nothing against her either. Like, it's just some people know more about it than others. And I can imagine it's probably would take a lot for someone to decide to float this to their client. But when I finally met the diagnosing psychiatrist who I worked with, he was very curious and interested. And I came in trying to be somewhat skeptical. I came in trying to say, I'm not sure about this. And he goes, well, I don't know. What you're telling me is that you have 4 degrees, and you've written 9 books, and you've raised 4 children, and you've lived in 4 states. And this doesn't seem like a typical life. And I was like, huh, I never thought about it that way. Maybe it's not a typical life. Like, I just, I'm just scrambling to do everything that I can.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like there's, something weird about my path there. But yeah, and sort of like looking at the evidence from the outside, he saw something that a lot of other people hadn't. And maybe it's because he was more educated on the subject and sees a little bit more through that lens. And he noticed a lot of other things that my therapist never mentioned. Like, he noticed I don't make eye contact. He noticed I don't sit still. Like, a lot of things that just never came up. And of course, I imagine that in a therapy situation, you don't always point out the person's idiosyncrasies and make them self-conscious of themselves in the room, but when discussing autism, it becomes relevant.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that some people are prepared for and some people aren't. So yeah, trying to find a neuro-affirming therapist is great. And of course, I do life coaching for ADHDers. And the difference between therapy and life coaching is, there are multiple, as a lot of people know.
Mm-hmm.
But life coaching really tries to take a forward-looking, action-oriented view of things, so that you can, make plans and goals and measure them, But we also do unpacking of our past and better understanding of ourselves, lots of education about our interactions and things like that. And one thing and I don't mean to disparage therapy. I think it's an important part of many people's lives, and I wish access were better for everybody.
Yeah.
But there are some aspects of talk therapy where you're taught to challenge intrusive thoughts, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is, for autistics, lots of our intrusive thoughts are based on very real experiences, like not ill perceptions of ourselves and the way we've been treated by, a caregiver or something, but by the fact that we have been ostracized, we have been excluded, we have been let go from positions for completely, to us, irrational reasons. And challenging our thoughts about ourselves during a social interaction becomes counterproductive, where it's better to dive into that thought and say, okay, what am I seeing here that has caused me problems in the past? And how can I try to leverage some understanding between me and this person? And of course, it shouldn't be our job to always be the person who walks over to neurotypical understanding, but to try and show them, you need to come my way, I need to come yours. There's something off here, and I don't think that we're being productive how we are. And again, which is not to say that every therapist is different, every coach is different, and it's hard to find the right fit for everybody.
Right.
And again, like, I wish access were better. Therapy there aren't enough therapists in the country to give everybody therapy. I forget what the percentage is, but I know last year it was something like 21% of people had some form of therapy, and that's the most that's ever happened in the country, which is probably hats off to Gen Z, but coaching is expensive is the other thing. Like, coaching can't take insurance, and it's a shame that any sort of care like that should be just for people who can afford it. And that just, further points out the inequities that bring about all sorts of problems for so many people. And anyway, that is an aspect of my profession that haunts me, is I would like to be able to give back, as well as, working with those who can afford me. And it's difficult.
Yeah, I often get into conversations here and there about the things that used to be a public good, but is no longer. And, these areas, along with education, so many different realms, but we are still trying to exist within these systems, right? As you say. Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't say that there's a certain amount of pragmatism that works into it. And the recognition that you can't change a system if you are not secure and stable and have the resources to be aware of yourself. And I stress that because a lot of people feel like it's really selfish to address their own contentment and happiness when there's so many people who are more disadvantaged than you, who don't have the same advantages, obviously, as you have, which is not to say they can't be content and happy, of course, but saying that, like, we often feel guilty about that, because the autistic and ADHD drive for social justice makes us keenly aware of the times where we have more than other people. And it's not your own personal guilt. It's an aspect of the time and place where we're born. And there are a lot of things that should be happening better for everybody. And so I do try to stress to people that taking care of yourself and getting yourself in a place where you can be effective in helping other people is much more important than giving in to the despair of lots of our social inequities.
Well, you have this line that you've shared that, neurodivergence is maladaptive to a capitalist society. And I was like, that's exactly it. And particularly when you talk about the intense sense of justice, which used to, I realize a lot of people misread that. It can come off in all kinds of different ways, but it comes out of that intense sense of justice. And I've never heard it described in that way, but it is very maladaptive to a capitalist society that is meant to step on each other in a particular way in society.
Historically, for people who had a strong voice, it was hard to see the inequity in the system, because you had white males were like, this is working fine. Like, what are you guys talking about? Like, and we're the ones writing the books. We're the ones writing the laws. Like, this seems fine. We're working hard and we're making ourselves rich. And of course, that's the mistake, is thinking that you got rich by working hard. You got rich because you had advantages that other people didn't have, and the system was built to serve you. And as things have progressed, little by little by little, those inequities are being better felt. And of course, much of the inequities, we're not being better felt, they're being better voiced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the past, a lot of that voice comes from the richness of the American music experience, where you have really given a voice to many people who are disadvantaged historically,
Mm-hmm.
which is why our music evolution is so powerful, I think. And yet people still are able to sort of walk past that. But as we've gotten to a place where we're trying to allow more voices, we're being more keenly aware of the fact that this isn't a meritocracy, and that there are a lot of things that we should be doing differently. It's become, I think, a heavier weight in the minds of the neurodivergent, who's looking at the system piecemeal, bottom up, and thinking like, wow, this isn't fair, and this isn't fair, and this isn't fair. And it can be just overwhelming. And but it's also been seen, I think, in a lot of different commentary, that capitalism is sociopathic. The book American Psycho and the resulting movie is a good example. I study this sometimes with my students, and it's a very violent and terrifying movie in a lot of ways. And I try to impress upon them that really what we're seeing is somebody whose motive is to fit in. Mm-hmm. Somebody whose motive is to be popular.
Yeah.
And he's working through this system to become like, a financial success. And part of that is just, stepping all over people. That capitalism is about competition. And we begin to see it everywhere. Like, who hasn't seen it in school? Like, why should we ever be in competition in school? And I have worked with professors who see it in their classrooms favorably. I've had professors who sit there and say things like, oh, almost nobody passed this test. And I'm like, are you a terrible teacher? Like, your job is to get them to pass the test. Like, you're not supposed to make something so hard that they can't pass it unless you are committed to getting them to that point. And I think that there's still just this like thought of this misconception of, social Darwinism, because Darwinism is not actually about the individual, it's about the species. And we've misconstrued this notion of survival of the fittest to mean individuals. And it's really kind of gross how we've prized that so hard. I always tell people, because you look at, God, I'm sorry, this is a tangent, but that's what I do.
Yeah, please.
I always tell people who look at this, because I have so many people studying the arts and the humanities, and there's this constant need for justification of majoring in things that you find enriching. And meanwhile, sports is such a big deal because it is clear and obvious competition. And I always say, we built a Sparta instead of an Athens. We did not dive into the sort of like cultural realms that we should have as a society. And instead we're looking at like, who beats who and like who's more badass. And it's hard because we could be making everybody better. We could all be helping each other out, and you could still see sports and you could see it as everybody improving, but we never perceive it that way. Gosh, to give one more example, my daughter is a speed cuber. And if you haven't been to a Rubik's Cube competition, a speed cuber, she does competitive Rubik's Cubing. Yeah,
yes.
Very big in the autism community. If you haven't been to a competition, I recommend it, because you have never seen people go up against each other in such a tense situation and support each other so much. Just like so well. They really want to see the best in each other. I have never seen somebody like be upset about being beat. They've been proud of how far the other person has gone, and they're up there sitting in front of people and they have to solve this cube in 3 seconds. And I can't imagine a more like pressure filled thing. And it's just wonderful to see people cheer each other on. And I look at that and just go, why isn't everything this way? Why don't we all just cheer for each other like this? And I think it's part of it is that's a really neurodivergent community of people who really hyper focused on this skill,
Well, I think that's so
7
interesting that you
seconds.
talk
She did it in
about
7 seconds. So
7 seconds. Dang.
yeah, my daughter did it in 7 seconds the other day, which places her, I think, in like the top 100 of females or something like that. But still pretty far from the world champ.
I could never. So that is so far beyond my imagination.
I,
But, it is interesting when you talk about neurodivergence having special interests, finding very specific things that really resonate with you tend to be, rather than focusing on the disabling part of it, there are also gifts, as you've mentioned. So why is it important for neurodivergent people to find their interest and their strengths, which you've talked about?
Yeah, I worked through positive psychology, which is a movement that arguably started with Maslow, I think is how people can really understand it if you haven't studied it directly, but has been refined by Martin Seligman. And the idea is that psychology is usually used to minimize deficits, that you see somebody is like not doing well, they're at like -5, and you want to bring them back up to 0, which is balanced. But positive psychology says if you're at 0, we have the science to try to get you to 3 or 4. Why not use things to make everybody better and not just, and so one of the things that is really impressed in positive psychology is to focus on your strengths and recognize your weaknesses and try to lean on other people for that. Try to build community by offering your strengths to other people and borrowing their strengths when you need them. And which is, something that I think families do really well. Historically. Yeah, one thing I've really noticed is that our special interests help us to focus for long periods of time, and they help us to feel a sense of contentment and satisfaction. And all of those things help fill that bandwidth, fill that bucket. It gives us spoons, if you will, to be able to do those things. And, scientifically, one way to improve your attention and executive function, which is something that all ADHDers wrestle with, is to experience periods of intense focus. And again, this is maladaptive to our society. My high schooler is going to go to school today and do 6 different classes. And when that bell rings, you move from one subject to the next, one subject to the next. And the suggestion being that, poetry is exactly 45 minutes important. And so is history. And so is algebra. And for me, switching gears 6 times a day is exhausting. Every transition, it takes spoons. Every transition makes me have to stop and reset. I almost always would choose to do one subject all day long until I'm finished with it, instead of, having arbitrary time limits on it. So we see that in school, we see this in the workplace, everything built on this sort of factory system, and we're exhausted at the end of the day. And then we don't have the time and energy to put into those special interests. And I really try to encourage my clients to do it anyway. That the one day that you get home and you have more energy than you did before, something went right at work, or it was a little easier day, and you have that energy to try and approach your special interest, whatever it is, give it 20 minutes. And usually if any ADHDer gives 20 minutes to their special interest, they will get lost in it and it'll keep going. And if we can start doing that, I really try to impress upon people that all of the tools we have to try and improve your function as an ADHDer are hard. They're really hard. Exercise, sleep, and long periods of concentration, mindfulness. This is stuff that we are especially not adept at. And so it's kind of like we're playing chess with all pawns. Not only are we at a disadvantage, but we're still at a disadvantage, in trying to figure out how to build advantages. And so I try to impress upon people that when you are doing well, when you are having a good day, that's the time to make a change. When it seems like you don't need the help, that's the time to start developing these, rituals in your life, so that you will begin to, mindfulness meditation takes about 3 weeks of 10 to 20 minutes a day before you see any results. By the time 3 weeks passes, on average, everything is average. So we're going up and down all the time. Your moods and function is going to change within 3 weeks. So if you're doing well right now, you can guess that in 3 to 8 weeks, you're going to be doing a little worse than you are right now, just by averages. So this is the time to start working on it so that you have those advantages. And once you see that advantage, we live in a world in our brains of cause and effect. And if you don't see that effect immediately, a lot of us just discount it and don't keep investing. And you have to bridge that gap cognitively by telling yourself, I know I don't see an effect here, but I need to keep working. And it's like the first time you exercise and you feel sore, you're seeing the effect and it's not rewarding. And you have to bridge that gap and say, I'm going to take it easy now, and then I'm going to do it again in 2 days. And just keep remembering that these long-term solutions are really the only things that are going to help us long-term. And just start developing them when you have the spoons for it.
I used to beat myself up so much about riding the wave. Like I used to think that was a wrong approach, meaning really, if I can discern my energy and what's happening with me internally, that I should just accept it and work with it. But instead I was taught growing up to build resistance to everything. That was a sign of fortitude, right? And that just completely, that's the opposite of following your own groove.
That's true.
Take some time to.
Gosh, that's true. A lot of.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of the advice that's given to like most people is sort of opposite from what neurotypicals should be doing. I mean, sorry, neurodivergents should be doing. And yeah, riding the wave. Like if you find yourself like feeling like you need to clean, my God, this is your one chance this year. Like, to clean up a little bit. Like,
yes.
Like, and I'll find myself. I'll have a big
cleanup.
Right. And I'll find myself like, with procrastinating on a project or something and going, God, but the kitchen's so dirty. And it's like, at that point, if it's the deadline's not actually breathing down my neck, I'm going to go clean that kitchen because I know it needs it. Procrastinating is something that ADHDers do a lot. And I suggest that we really need to do that mindfully, because when you do procrastinate, you're letting the stress do the work. So you're not exhausting your mental capacities as much. But chronically over time, that stress is really bad for you. So you have to kind of pick and choose your battles. And there's some things that you think 70 or 80% is good enough. Those are the things to sort of procrastinate on. And the things that are really important, you need to work on now. And that's a tangent from cleaning your kitchen. And I'm sorry.
Speaking of tangent, though, I do have some questions that are probably more on the fun side, because how often I'm going to ask about this. So I used to be, this has been a while, but I used to be quite the avid ghost hunters watcher. You used to do paranormal investigating, and I can't help but ask.
Wow, you've Googled me.
I have Googled you.
Yeah.
Interesting anecdotes, anything that might be interesting to say, because how often I'm going to ask about this.
Yeah, okay. I've always been interested in that kind of stuff. Like I just assume that since we learn so much all the time, what we know historically is that whatever we're thinking right now, we're wrong. If you look back in history, as right as anybody could be, about changing systems, Copernicus, Galileo, like they were still wrong. Like they had a lot of stuff right, but they still had most of their stuff wrong. And every step forward is a step towards realizing that we don't know what we don't know. And so I assume that there's stuff going on all the time that I'm just not going to be aware of, and that our society is not going to be aware of. So I never look down on things that are woo or paranormal or whatever. I approach it with some interest. I think if you're keying into this, there's something going on, whatever. I have an interesting theory about tarot cards. But anyway, I was living in Michigan, in Bay City, Michigan, and I somehow came across, and I want to say it was the MySpace page of the Bay City Paranormal Society. And I was like, let me look into this. And they were just a group of people who got together and would look into hauntings and go, doing the ghost hunting thing. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because everywhere I lived, I've lived in lots of different places. Everywhere I've lived, I've gone to a local bookstore and looked for the local authors section. And almost every local bookstore in the local authors section has a sort of self-published book about local ghost legends.
Yeah.
And I just I love them. Like they're not especially literary, but they're the urban legends and folk tales of that area, and it helps me get to know that area, because it'll always talk about the histories and that kind of stuff. So I've always had a fascination in that, and I'm like, well, okay, well, I just moved to Bay City, let me look into this. And so I participated in a few different investigations, and what we would do was go and interview people, and then like go and set up overnight and do like recordings and walk around. And a lot of it was more fun than anything. But it's interesting because at the time I was working in a college, and my office was in the basement of this building, and it was one of the places that was supposed to be haunted. And so I told them, I said, the basement of building is supposed to be haunted. And I was usually the first person there. I like getting places before anybody else is there. And I noticed some things. I noticed like hearing whistling. I noticed the smell of like pipe tobacco. And I'd look around thinking, is there some professor down here smoking pipe tobacco? And he shouldn't be. And there never was anybody else there. And turned out, talking to other people in the department, that was a common sort of part of the legend. So we set up and did an investigation there, and we found some really weird stuff, like office equipment turning on by itself, which, maybe there's something that happens with maintenance that we don't understand overnight. But the weirdest one was that in one of the hallways, they'd recorded like at like 3 a.m. or something, recorded the sound of two kids playing. And I was like, oh, this is messed up. I can't be the first person in this building anymore.
It got too real.
Yeah, I was like, I am not doing this. And I listened to it over and over again, and like everything we could correct for. And of course, this was years ago, but everything we could correct for, we had corrected for. And as far as we could tell, this recording came from just setting up in an empty hallway that night. And I was like, this is a lot. So it was fun. It was fun. It was very casual, it was very casual, but it made me really interested. And along the vein of that, I ended up writing a children's book series about, ghost legends in California, called California Dreadfuls. And I really wanted to like dive into each sort of city that had its own particular sort of like cryptid or myth or legend, and write something that would link it to the history and the cultures who have inhabited the area, and thinking kind of like Goosebumps, except for with a little bit more emotional intelligence and hopefully diversity. Nothing against Goosebumps, what a great series. But so anyway, yeah, that's one of those things that like once I got interested, it just kind of kept going on and on until I decided I would create something with it,
I have some friends who, out of that curiosity of also, it's just a bit of like, if you're like a history buff, it kind of ties into these like stories, right? And they would turn it into, horror anthologies or like cryptid illustrations because they're like an illustrator. So it's so funny how these things get expressed. I got to know though, what's your theory about tarot cards?
Okay. Here's what, like, I don't want to discount anybody's like woo-ness with them. Like I know some folks who do tarot readings, and they have, intuitive insights from them. And I'm taking nothing away from that. But the average person who is not believing in woo, I do recommend doing a tarot card spread. So you have 78 cards, and each card can be in one of two positions. And then you place them down on 10 different points. I'm thinking of a Celtic cross spread. You place them down on 10 different points. Every time you shuffle a deck of cards, you get a combination of cards that has never existed before. Like there are so many combinations, and I'm talking about a 52 card deck. When you shuffle, that order of cards statistically has never existed. Like it's impossible. So with 78 cards, you're getting an order that's never existed before. And then you're thinking about a situation in your life. Should I change jobs? Should I, marry the girl, whatever it is? And then you set down in 10 different aspects of the influences of that situation. And let's just say that nothing woo is happening, and you're getting random cards that each mean something. It forces you to think in ways that you don't normally think, because we get in these thinking patterns. Our neurons create these like riverbeds in our brain, and we think the same way all the time. So this is a way to introduce a point of view you never would have had before. And it forces you to be insightful. So you're like, you read like, this is the passing influence, and it's the, Queen of Wands. And you're like, who could this represent in my life? And you go, okay, I could see that. And then you look at like, each little thing until you have like examined 10 different points of this decision through random means that you never would have before. And it's like forcing lateral thinking. Marketers do a sort of same thing when they're trying to market a product and they have no idea where to go with this. They will open up a dictionary and point at a random word and say, I need each of you to come up with 50 ways that this word relates to our product. And it's just like random injection forces you to be novel. And takes you out of our normal everyday stuff. So I really do think that there's like, people make pros and cons lists all the time, and I've never seen anything good come from a pros and cons list. Like every time you do that, you're like, oh God, yeah. But it's a way to concentrate on a situation with totally new inputs, and it's about 30 minutes or so, and can really get you to consider it. And I don't do it all the time, but I've done it once in a while and found it very cathartic, if nothing else. And I mean, the same thing, like, the I Ching or any other form of divination makes you like approach this from a way that you wouldn't normally approach it. And usually if you're struggling with something, the tools that got you into that struggle are probably not going to get you out. And I stress that to autistics all the time, because we always think that our situations and our emotions can be solved. Like we think I'm going to look back and unwind this and solve it with my brain. But sometimes you just have to feel those emotions and reset yourself, because the tools that got you into that situation are usually you trying to solve your emotions. And that's made it get in deeper,
Yeah. I wrote down this line that I heard in your shares in your content that was like, success is not a circus trick away. I'm sorry. Something to that effect. And I think that kind of like echoes what you're talking about now, right? It's like systemic problems, but solution may look very individualized.
Yeah. And, I mean, we see that all the time. We see, people buy self-help books, and it's amazing, because if you had a self-help book that really solved your problems, it would be a bestseller, and people wouldn't have problems. And which is not to say they don't have great insight and make you think in different ways. I like that. It's the same thing with school. The notion that you're going to go through school in this one size fits all like idea of what everybody should know is going to like do what? Turn you into some sort of an expert? Because that's what I thought it was supposed to do. And it turns out you actually have to put in your own work on the back end and use school as like more like exposure therapy, that you're being exposed to things, and now you have to follow your curiosity, or else you're not doing anything. You're following instructions. And then school becomes a 12-year cycle of how well can you follow instructions? How well can you sit still? And that's not learning, So it's the same thing. I'll talk about problems all the time on TikTok, and people will be like, yes, but what's the answer? And it's like, I would have told you the answer.
Yeah.
But you really do have to sit. Like I've sat with clients, and it's been like 5 or 6 weeks into it before anything like an answer or a new approach sometimes comes to the surface. And you never know where that's going to come from or what it's going to be. And it's very individual, because we have systemic problems, like our systems and our ways of being and our neurotypes put us into situations that are somewhat universal. But there is no one way out. And if there were, we would have told you, and it would have, like, everything would be a lot easier. But when it comes down to it, another thing that I get into Buddhism sometimes and say that really, whatever your problems are that's making you suffer, that's just the texture of your suffering. Being a person, being a thinking person in a world that's temporary, and with the psychology that's gotten our species to survive through the veldt, and now we live in cities, that being alive, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be some measure of suffering, and what you're experiencing is a certain texture, and you can address that and change the texture of your suffering. But it's better to try and address how to be content in a world that's not going to be perfect. That an easy answer is not going to come along and make things perfect. So you have to figure out how to adapt in a way that is the most tolerable, the least exhausting texture of suffering, if that makes sense. So everything's give and take that way, and it's a sort of hard truth to swallow. But because I think we've been taught this idea that we're on this journey towards some sort of like perfectly happy, enlightened state, and we don't have to put out any effort anymore. But our species is not made to be satisfied. If it was, the first time you wanted a donut, you'd eat a donut and you'd never want one again. Like, wow, that was great. It was just how I thought it would be. Don't need it again.
Right.
And the first time you went to Disneyland, you wouldn't need to go to Disneyland again. The first time you had sex, you wouldn't have to have sex again. Like, but we're made to come back and back and back. So we're made to not be content. We have to create, again, bridging that gap cognitively, create our own contentment. Part of that is coming up with our own personal goals and our own personal ways of measuring ourselves, instead of sticking with this whole idea of money and success and A+ report cards.
I just have this one other thing that I noted that you're kind of reflecting on, so I want to bring it up. You've described this experience, particularly when you were getting your PhD, I believe, or in grad school, of imposter syndrome and feeling like you were faking it through. And you had this line, and something about it just deeply resonated with me, which is why I'm bringing it up. But it felt like you got to the same destination, but not by following any of the rules or the roadmap as some of your peers. And it created this experience of like, you got there wrong or something like that. I'm curious if you can unpack that a little bit more, because that felt deeply resonant for me.
Yeah, that's a big one for me. And again, thinking about the whole school thing, I have a doctoral equivalent in education, and one thing I've really learned from studying that was that so much of school is performance. That you practice something and perform it, and it's not really made to be a learning experience so much as it is made to be a performance. Which the learning can happen that way, but not necessarily anyway. Yeah, I would get to a writing class, especially, and I'd write something. We'd have an assignment and I write it, and then it's like we'd spend the next several weeks like doing outlines and doing research and practicing transitions and all these other little steps that I didn't want to do. They didn't make any sense to me. I already wrote the essay, and I can fix the essay, but I don't want to go through all these steps. And I realized that I could write my way through anything. For example, as a senior in college, I had to read 5 books a week. I was a literature major, and I left a lot of literature classes to the end because I was dyslexic. I could not read 5 books a week. So what I would do is keep plates in the air, read the books that I had to for the classes I was struggling in, and the other ones I'd pay attention to class conversation. And then when it came time to write an essay about the book, I would pivot that essay towards something else that I already knew a lot about. So 1 week we're reading Jane Eyre. I didn't get a chance to read it. But I had a really great lecture in Taoism. So what I'm going to do is take the tidbits that I know about Jane Eyre and pivot it towards this is how Jane Eyre is actually a instruction in Taoism. And I'd write an essay about Taoism, and the teacher would go, wow, this guy's really overthinking this. This is amazing. He brought a perspective I've never seen. And yeah, I would just feel like, God, I lied my way through that one. But what I realized was that I was navigating a system and, coming up with ways to solve these things. And it's any kid who's good at math knows they don't want to show their work, and you have to show your work. And it becomes we do feel like we get there the wrong way. We don't turn in all the assignments. Like my roommate would go and study at the library, and his thing was the library closed at midnight. He was studying till midnight every night, and he was a computer science major. And I used to ask him, what is studying? Like, what are you doing there? Like, what's the action? Like, you're saying study, and I understand that you mean that you are learning more about this, but I'm like, are you reading? Are you writing notes? Are you doing calculations? Like, what does studying mean? I never understood that word because I never studied. And so I really felt like, I was somewhat of a fraud going through all of that. But at one point I realized, especially with the writing, I realized, oh, I see, I'm a writer. And these writing classes are made for people who aren't writers, that they don't see themselves as writers, and they struggle with it, and they need a formula to follow so they feel like they can do it. And, I teach writing classes, and the ways they're supposed to be taught are not how any writer writes. I can't tell, the different clauses of sentences and stuff like that. Like, I just do it, and it comes from a lifetime of reading and writing, and it generally comes together. So, and that's one of the problems with school, and one of the problems with, power structures, is that the people who are teaching are the ones who are really rewarded by the system. That they went through the system, they got their A's, they did their work right, they behaved in class, And they got so much out of it. And they're like, why would we change this? It's so effective. It's so life-changing. And so even though the research says something like you shouldn't be giving homework, that kids should not have homework, sometimes they should practice math, they should memorize timetables. But other than that, like, they shouldn't have homework. And their teacher's like, yeah, but homework's so great for you because it worked for them. And so it makes it really easy to look away from what we know and follow these anecdotal stories in our head. And, just like the white men who felt like the competition of capitalism was so effective, teachers are where they are because school was so effective for them. And it's not for everybody. So these are a few of the axes I have to grind. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That was so fascinating. Okay. A couple other things, because I want to respect your time, but you've dabbled in a ton of instruments. Do you have a favorite?
Right now, I'm really into ukulele.
Cool.
And there's a reason for that. They're very portable. Yeah, they're portable. You can get a few chords on them pretty easy, and they're relatively cheap. And I like instruments as an object, so they're easier to collect. Like I was into guitars for a long time, but you can only buy a guitar every few years because they're so freaking expensive. The ones that you want. But you can get a ukulele, for a pretty affordable price. One extra paycheck, and you can get a ukulele. But so I've been really into that lately. Historically, stand-up bass. I played it in orchestra, and then I played it in rock bands, and really liked that. The instrument I'm actually best at, and everybody laughs, recorder. I am so good at recorder. And awesome. I used to play in an early music group, and I used to play it in my high school band. I would integrate recorder into the songs, and I just got really fluent. It was like the recorder was an extension of my mind, and it let me know that I actually sucked at every other instrument I played. But that's one of the things is I'll start playing an instrument, I'll start getting into something, and I'll feel guilt that I'm not learning something else. I'll be playing ukulele and go, God, I should have learned banjo. I can't believe I haven't learned banjo. So I'll start playing banjo, and I'm like, Jesus, classical guitar exists, and I don't know that. And here I am working on banjo. So it's really hard to stay focused. I think I like instruments in general, and I've given myself over to not being any good, but allowing myself to practice because I find it very regulating.
Yeah, I'm a pianist myself. So that is
I wish
absolutely my special interest. But I had to I really had to tweak in my 30s how I approach music in general, just the way that I was taught, the exercises that had to be disciplined in. And then now it's more being neurospicy, I found that I could be kind of more of a music improviser. I had no idea that was the case when I went to music conservatory. None at all. So
yeah, music is taught as imitation so much.
Yeah.
And we know, I don't know, art shouldn't be taught as imitation. At least kids should be dabbling and playing with art, although you do see increasingly these programs where they're taught to imitate so that they have a product very quickly so parents can see this and think, wow, my kid's learning art, but they spent 45 minutes learning art. But yeah, music, I don't, one reason I don't play very often in the house is I like to play something very repetitive for a very long time, and it's meditative for me, and I know that can be irritating to other people. And piano wise, when I used to play piano, same thing. I would get very meditative, sort of like a Harold Budd, Brian Eno type vibe, and just stay there. And I knew it was irritating to people, so I usually put on my headphones and plugged into an electric piano.
Yeah.
Because repetitious noise would bother me too if I wasn't making it.
Yeah, I'm living in my place in New York City. I definitely have my headphones in, which helps with what you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being willing to connect with me, and I kind of figured we would just roll right into a conversation, a neurospicy conversation, as they say. So those are always fun. Yeah.
That's how I run classes too. I always start out with so how are you guys doing? And eventually we'll get on the subject we wanted to talk about, but sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah. So thank you for your time, and I hope we can keep in touch and stay connected. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to do it again. So just let me know.
Perfect.
Thank you for tuning in. Listeners are welcome to connect with me over Instagram and LinkedIn. You just have to search my name, and I love to hear from you. If you'd like to learn more about my work as a coach and artist, please visit www.robertkwonghome.com. neurodivergent.com.